We're continuing in our learning of Franz Rosenzweig and the return to Judaism. And the last few sessions, we've been focusing on Franz Rosenzweig's approach to halacha and the various dimensions to it. And in particularly in the last session, we were exploring how Rosenzweig navigates between these two extremes that dominate much of the contemporary thinking about halacha, right? You have the approach of orthodoxy, which basically says you must do all mitzvot, you must keep all halacha, there's no exceptions, that's it, you must do it all. That's one extreme. And that extreme will argue that it's the traditional approach, it's always been that way. We'll dive into maybe more next week about whether that's really, really the case or not, or whether there might be a little bit more nuance there. And the alternative approach is the one often associated with non-Orthodox Judaism, that basically Jewish law is optional, right? You don't have to keep it. It's not necessary to be a good Jew that you have to keep halacha. And we even saw the position of Buber, who thinks that, if you're keeping the law because you think you have to, that might actually get in the way of a true religious or spiritual experience. And Rosenzweig tried to navigate a path between those two, one that is not everything or nothing, but rather what he says is something, right? That's what we have to build our relationship to Torah and Judaism on, this idea of something, particularly for the baal teshuvah, right? The baal teshuvah can't just leap in and start keeping all the mitzvot, right? It's just not possible for them. If they were going to try to do that, it would mean fundamentally sacrificing everything that they are, right? Which for Rosenzweig would defeat the purpose, right? Torah, mitzvot, God, these things have to be real for you, and they can't be real for you if it means giving up everything that you were before. On the nothing dimension, again, right? Like for Rosenzweig, Jewish law is one of these central ways in which we can connect to God, right? Jewish law always has the possibility of becoming mitzvah, becoming that moment in which you see yourself in direct relationship with God, you hear God's call, so to speak. So for him, the challenge is the something. And he bases it on this drasha that we saw last time, a drasha that appears in the Gemara, v'chai behem v'lo sheyamut behem, right? That you must live in the mitzvot, that you should not die in them, which we explained last time was Rosenzweig's way of saying that the mitzvot, that something of the mitzvot that you can do is the mitzvot that you basically can't live without, right? In the process, the challenge is finding what those are for you, because that becomes the foundation for all religious and spiritual growth. If you try to do too much, you're going to fail, or it's going to be artificial and forced. The challenge is to find those that you can't live without and let that be the foundation of your something. So what I want to do today is I want to explore exactly what it means for Rosenzweig to discover this something, this dimension of halacha and mitzvot that we can't live without. And for us, you might say the question is a little different, meaning if you're already somebody who is, engaged religiously in a serious fashion, we already have an engagement with halacha and mitzvot. But what do you do if you're starting out with nothing, right? Which is basically the question that Rosenzweig wants to explore. And it is relevant even for those who are already inside the tradition, but his starting point is somebody who is coming from nothing. How does one start the process of engaging halacha and mitzvot when one is completely unmoored from the Jewish tradition? And we know that just diving in and taking everything on all at once is not an option, because as I said, it will lead one to sacrificing who they are rather than enabling one to truly engage authentically with Torah. So the first text I want to look at, another very interesting text, is another letter of Franz Rosenzweig. It's a letter to Mavrik Khan. Mavrik Khan was a fellow soldier of Rosenzweig's during World War I, a fellow German Jewish soldier, and they actually met together in a military hospital where Rosenzweig was convalescing due to pneumonia. The two made a connection while they were in the hospital over their shared desire to reconnect to the Jewish tradition, right? They actually found that they had this Jewish connection and a passion for Judaism in common. And this was not so unusual for many young German Jews of Rosenzweig and Kahn's generation, because a lot of these young Jews felt that their parents' Judaism was intellectually and spiritually bankrupt, and they found themselves searching for something more. And the challenge, of course, is that they didn't really know what that something more was, right? The alternative was basically Reform Judaism and then Orthodoxy. But it wasn't clear for these Jews who had grown up Reformed, but really had grown up assimilated, what really could be their next steps towards returning to the tradition. What's clear in the letter is that Khan is particularly enamored with Hasidim, and he clearly sees Hasidut as a authentic Jewish spiritual path, and one that he feels himself drawn towards. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that there are no Hasidim in Germany for the most part. Hasidim were located only in Eastern Europe. German Jews were exposed to Hasidim, like many American Jews are, through the lens of popular culture and literature. Meaning, I think American Jews today have more exposure to Hasidim, but 30, 40 years ago, most American Jews had never met a Hasid, and if they had any exposure to it, it was through stories. It was through, Shalom Aleichem, right? It was through like these depictions in literature and things like that. They did not have firsthand experiences with them, and that is certainly the case for German Jews as well. Martin Buber translates a collection of Hasidic stories into German in the early 20th century, and they become very popular. People are very enamored with these stories about Hasidic life and what it represents. But because German Jews had no firsthand experience with Hasidim, it was easy for German Jews to romanticize them, to sort of like imagine Hasidim as holy and pure in a way that assimilated German Jews were fundamentally lacking, right? We're the ones who are disconnected from the tradition. Look at this Hasidim, right? They have this authentic connection. Everything is natural and normal for them. They have real relationship with God. We've lost our faith, right? They have what we don't have, right? This was the sort of the fantasy that German Jews had. And because of this sort of romanticization, you'll see in the letter, Rosenzweig is actually skeptical of Mavri Khan's desire to connect with Hasidut, because Rosenzweig knows that the search for spiritual experience, spiritual meaning, can often be misleading. And then over the course of the letter, Rosenzweig articulates critical points about what does it mean to actually return to the tradition. So he opens the letter as follows, and it's essentially a criticism of Khan. He says, do you think that a deed so forced, so crooked, so impossible, like your attempt to join with the Hasidim, is of such greater value than your understanding, which is the correct conclusion, that it is very crooked, very forced, and impossible to do? You do not believe this. So what Rosenzweig is saying to Khan is that you know your desire to become a Hasid is impossible, right? You're modern, you're secular, you're an assimilated German. You don't believe the things that Hasidim believe, and your way of life is completely removed from theirs. So if Rosenzweig knows that Khan knows this, right, that deep down Khan knows this is like just a fantasy, he can't just go become a Hasid or anything like that, then why is Khan pursuing this dream of the Hasidim? So in truth, we have to describe this as a fantasy. And what Rosenzweig is implying is that Khan has this fantasy of how he imagines Hasidim, and that it's the fantasy that draws him to them. It's not stated here, but we could probably guess it. Hasidim aren't disconnected from the Jewish tradition in any way. It's as real to them as to our ancestors. I mean, that's Khan's fantasy. The Hasidim got what we lost long ago. They're passionate, spiritual. They live a life in close connection to God and a close connection to each other, right? All the things that modern society has taken away from the assimilated German Jews. That's the fantasy that the Hasidim have. Their lives are pure. They eschew the trappings of materialism, and therefore they can lead a simpler life, right? These are all the kinds of things that would be, he'd be thinking about. And of course, all of that is a vast improvement over the modern condition and the messiness and alienation of modern life. The problem, of course, with this kind of fantasy is that it simply isn't true. It's a fantasy. That's fantasies are. They're impossible. They're wishes more than reality. Hasidim are not all tzaddikim, and they don't all live deeply spiritual lives, and far from it. And again, it's not just Khan that romanticizes Hasidim. You'll see this even today. American Jews, even modern Orthodox Jews, will romanticize Hasidim as having all these wonderful things that we have somehow lost. But there's something very problematic with this conception, with this kind of fantasy, that prevents one from having an authentic relationship to the Jewish tradition if one really wants to grow in it seriously. Because for Rosenzweig, a fantasy cannot be the basis of a genuine and real religious identity. For that to be possible, just as the baal teshuvah cannot sacrifice their lives by diving fully into mitzvot, so too they can't dive into a fantasy, which requires them to sacrifice reality in a different way. Right, so that's the initial problem. Khan, you know this is a fantasy you have about Hasidim, and if that's the path you think that's going to bring you back to the tradition, you're deeply misguided. So then the question becomes, well, what should Khan do? What's going to be his recommendation to Khan about how he can connect more deeply, or how he should think about what that path is going to look like? So here's what he says. He says, I don't think, of course, that you need to return to try that which you have abandoned. And how can I suggest such a thing? I'm obligated to say to myself such things more than I am permitted to say them to you. Meaning I can't tell you to go back to reform, right? There's nothing there. That's stupid, right? So you can't go to Hasidim. You can't go to reform. Where does that leave you? And Rosenzweig recognizes this is something he has to grapple with as much as Khan if they're really serious about their Judaism. So what comes next? And this is what he says. I'm going to read the whole paragraph here, and then I'm going to try to unpack what Rosenzweig is getting at, because as is often the case, his language can be a bit cryptic. So here's what he says. He says, but one thing I can say to you nevertheless, because this is a simple fact that has disappeared from your eyes, like from the eyes of many today, because of the influence of the Christian environment that we have been impelled to live within. Meaning, because German Jews live in what's essentially a Christian environment, that Christian environment influences the way they think about Judaism in ways that Rosenzweig recognizes as problematic. Meaning, German Jews think about Judaism in more Christian terms, and that actually prevents them from connecting more authentically to Judaism. So what does that mean? So Rosenzweig says the matter of being a Jew is not a matter of emotion. Right? And this is very significant. And if we have to be, maybe the easiest way to describe it, in this paragraph, Rosenzweig is a litvak. He's a misnagid. Right? He is basically making the argument against the way we typically conceive of Hasidut. He's saying, don't imagine the heart of religious life is about emotional experience, right? Don't think that to be a good Jew, you have to have all these passionate, spiritual, emotional experiences when you pray or when you do mitzvot or whatever, right? It's not about this passionate, emotional dimension to it, right? The fact that you think that it's about this passionate, emotional dimension comes from a particular Christian way of thinking about religion. He says our emotion is in the blood. And again, this is kind of a strange expression, but what he means here is that we don't need, as Jews, to have all these powerful emotional, spiritual experiences. That's something Christians need because their whole conception of faith is based on that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But for Jews are born into Judaism, right? You are born, unless you convert, but you are ostensibly born a Jew, which means you're born already fully in the covenant, responsible for halacha and mitzvot when you become an adult, whereas Christians, particularly Protestants, have to be born again, right? They have to have some sort of transformative conversion, some sort of moment where they really become Christian later on in life. We as Jews don't need that. We don't need some emotional transformation where we suddenly wake up and realize, we're Jews, right? As Jews, we're born Jews, and we're born with a whole way of life, right? And we don't need these, emotional experiences to justify our Jewishness. It's already part of who we are. And again, I'll keep unpacking this. He says, towards the remaining things, meaning all the other aspects about being Jewish, one must first relate to them completely without romanticism, in a sober manner. Meaning, don't start romanticizing halacha and mitzvot and, start developing all these fantastical ideas about, the mitzvah is going to do this and the halacha is supposed to achieve that. And if I do the right thing, it's going to bring this powerful spiritual experience, right? He says, stay away from that. If you sort of go into halacha and Torah mitzvot with that kind of fantasy, it's going to be problematic. Right, again, the sober manner, right? This is where you can sort of see the misnagid dimension here. Your chassid also does not start with kavanah. And by kavanah, kavanah literally means intention, but here it means that the chassid doesn't start with the expectation that all of halacha and mitzvot are supposed to have this inner spiritual experience to it, right? Even the chassid, even the one we imagine who's all about emotion and spirituality, is still a Jew at heart. And to be a Jew at heart means orienting yourself towards Torah and mitzvot out of this simple sense of obligation, right? Of just doing it, right? That's what matters as a Jew. This is going to be Rosenzweig's main point here. If you want to know how to be a Jew, start the process of just being a Jew. Start doing halacha, start doing mitzvot. Don't do all of it all at once. That's not feasible. It's not good. It's not religiously meaningful. But you got to start somewhere, and you don't worry to wait until you sort of have inspiration, or you have emotion, or you finally understand what the real meaning of the mitzvah is, right? None of that is the fundamental Jewish approach. The fundamental Jewish approach is just start doing it. Like, that's what it means to be a Jew. He says someday this will come, right? This kavanah, right? It's not that meaning can't be found in being a Jew, but it's not the reason why we choose to be a Jew. But to want to begin this way with the meaning, with the emotion, with the spirituality is a problem. As we force ourselves to believe that we must act, this is completely not Jewish, right? To start with the kavanah, so to speak, as the essential requirement before you can begin is itself, as he says here, not so Jewish. So again, I want to unpack a little bit more about this contrast he's making between Judaism and Christianity. Because it is significant. And I'm not saying it applies to all forms of Christianity or all forms of Judaism, but it does grasp something essential about Judaism. And it also grasps something very essential about Protestant Christianity, which was obviously the dominant form of Christianity in Germany. So as I said before, for a Christian, faith, which is the central dimension of what it means to be a Christian, is something that happens to a person, right? In the most concrete sense, Jesus appears to you. And I don't know if you've ever heard conversion stories, but every Christian conversion story basically is a moment in which somebody experiences Jesus, right? Jesus appears to them. It's often a visual presence of Jesus, right? The most famous example of this is Paul on the road to Damascus, where he has a vision of Jesus in the New Testament. But that is often the paradigm for Christians, right? They have an awakening, a moment where everything changes for them because they experience, Jesus. And that model stays through a lot of Christian thinking, that Christian worship and Christian, practice is often oriented around emotional, spiritual experiences. So, for example, again, even today, the largest growing group of Christians is evangelicals. I think you probably know that, but it's specifically the charismatic evangelicals. And the charismatics are the evangelicals that really emphasize sort of the spiritual dimension of Christianity, what we call like literally the spirit, right? This idea that the outpouring of the spirit falls onto a person. And if you're familiar with the idea of speaking in tongues, right, that's a classic aspect of charismatic evangelical Christianity, right? This idea that the Holy Spirit falls upon a person and they experience something and they start speaking in tongues. Right, so this idea of emotional experience and really feeling something powerful and being transformed, these are deeply central to what it means to be a Christian. And the danger with a lot of this, before we even get to what's sort of why Judaism differs, but just sort of the obvious danger with a lot of this is that this kind of emphasis on spiritual meaning, on experience, on transformation tends to be narcissistic. As we know is the case often with spirituality. You've probably all seen people or talked to people who describe themselves as very spiritual, and what you realize very quickly, what they're really into is their own selves, right? They want to have good experiences for themselves. It's about them. It's not about connecting to necessarily something beyond themselves. If faith is about my experience, my emotions, my spirituality, or whatever, then it's all about me and what I want. And one can question whether God is really part of that at all. So that's I would say the problematic, the narcissistic dimension of this emphasis on emotion and experience and spirituality. And it's something that Rosenzweig finds very concerning because it creates this fantasy of what religious life is supposed to be. And people live this fantasy, but it's a very narcissistic fantasy at the end of the day. As Rosenzweig says, Jews are meant to be much more sober in their orientation to religious practice. It's not about emotion so much for us. It's not about a spiritual experience. It's not even so much about personal meaning. as Rosenzweig said, our emotion is in the blood. Like it's already there, this connection that we have, this inextricable connection that we have. And what it means ultimately is that to be born a Jew, to be born into the covenant, means being born with this sense of connection, these sense of obligations, obligations which echo with God's commanding voice. And that is how we're supposed to start off the Jewish path. Not with emotions or personal meaning. As he says here, your chassid also does not start with kavanah. Instead, we start with the actions, right? Chassidim are famous for the singing and the dancing and the tish and all of these things, and they're wonderful, and I enjoy them, but they're not the foundation of Jewish religious life, even for Chassidim themselves. Right? At the end of the day, Chassidim are like all Jews. They got mitzvot to do, and they're going to do them. Right? That's their core. That's their core orientation. Mitzvot need to emerge in our lives from a sense of inexorable connection that we have to them, not because they grant us access to some magical experience that makes us feel good. And Rosenzweig goes on to clarify this. He says, what you call joining with Knesset Yisrael, this is a beginning, which is, I'm sure it's a Kabbalistic idea, but probably he's drawing it here from Chassidut. But what he's saying is your connection to Judaism starts with your connection to other Jews, right? It's not about this religious fantasy or this grand theology. It's about your basic inexorable connection to other Jews that ties you to them, to this greater collective, and that part of that always comes with actions and responsibilities. If you're not capable of this, if you don't feel this inexorable connection to the Jewish people, to mitzvot, then what can you do to return to the tradition? So Rosenzweig says, if you don't already feel this connection, you must begin with something else, something completely sober, something self-aware. You should learn. You should busy yourself with. You should take interest in Judaism. And he's saying you should learn some Judaism, learn some Torah, busy yourself with Judaism, take interest in Judaism, and it doesn't matter what. Right? Just start the process of orienting yourself towards the concrete phenomenon that is Judaism, and through that beginning of making a connection, right, everything else is going to come. Learning, as we know, is essential, right? We talked about this a bit last time. But it doesn't just have to be an intellectual connection that Rosenzweig is saying make with Judaism. Busy yourself with it, find ways to engage with it, not out of some fantasy, but because one feels drawn to it, even if one can't quite put it into words. Through that engagement, Rosenzweig is confident a connection to mitzvot, to religious practice, will emerge. It won't happen with all of the mitzvot all at once, but it will happen if one is patient and makes the space for it. But there's got to be a way in which you're orienting yourselves to it to feel that connection start to grow. You have to do something to even begin to get to a point where you can start doing mitzvot. Rosenzweig goes on here. He says, from this we learn what we are supposed to do, not to wait for the experience to be aroused within us. Rather, a return is demanded to the experience already inhabited by our blood. Therefore, without sentimentality, don't come up with like all these nostalgic, wonderful reasons to do this stuff. Just start doing them without worrying about the purity of the present. All of this is Christian. The Christian is required to begin with kavanah. They need to have spiritual meaning and emotional experience, and they got to feel like Jesus is right there. That's not the way we start approaching it as Jews. We begin completely unsentimentally with commandments, with the study of Torah in any form, and in the end, kavanah will come. Right? That spiritual meaning can and will be there, but it's not where we start. And if you start there, it's obviously problematic, right? We can't wait for the moment when we feel inspired to suddenly take on mitzvot. If we depend on inspiration, one or two things are going to happen. Either we will be inspired, but it will be temporary and passing, not something you can really build an enduring commitment on. And again, I don't mean to pick on people who see themselves as spiritual. I see myself as spiritual, but we know people who seek out spiritual experiences, and it's always like one fad to the next fad, right? There's nothing that really has a sense of enduring commitment behind it. And if Judaism is anything, it's a sense of enduring commitment for Rosenzweig. And number two, inspiration may never come at all. One won't, in fact, move in any direction religiously. They'll just stay standing still. And they'll stay standing still, claiming that they're a spiritual seeker, that they want a connection with Judaism, but it's never really going to go anywhere. And I've met people like that too, right? Who say they're really interested in Judaism and can't really get beyond home plate, right? They can't get to first base to even really start taking those first steps to build an ongoing connection that might actually take them somewhere. Now, the other thing I'll mention here, which is I think very interesting, is within halacha, and I'm not sure Rosenzweig is aware of this, there is a debate whether or not mitzvot require kavanah. And we have to understand what kavanah means in the halacha context in the Gemara. But for our purposes, it basically means that as long as you're doing the act, like that's enough, right? As long as you're doing the act and you recognize on some level that it's a religious act, that's enough to fulfill the mitzvah, right? To fulfill a mitzvah halachically, you don't really have to know very much about what you're doing. You don't have to know Hebrew. You don't really have to understand the meaning of it at all. You just have to have some minimal sense that this is a religious act. And as long as that's the case and you do it, you fulfill it. So in many ways, when Rosenzweig is saying here, right, you think, mitzvot doesn't start with kavanah, he is getting at something very fundamental and basic about the orientation to be a Jew. Right, to be a Jew means you have these connections to these things and you just start doing them, and everything else comes from that. And I'll point out too, you actually see this distinction that Rosenzweig makes here between Christianity and Judaism in a very interesting place. This distinction between belief and faith and spiritual emotional experience, because that's all tied together, and this sort of Jewish orientation, which is just about start doing mitzvah, just do it. So where you see it is in the example of proselytizing. Now, we know Jews don't proselytize, at least to non-Jews, but Jews do sort of proselytize to Jews, right? At least Jews who aren't really so much connected to Judaism anymore. So for Christians, proselytizing is a big part of their faith, right? There are dimensions of Christianity that see it as a religious obligation, right? Jehovah's Witnesses, which aren't exactly Christian, but like they have it's a fundamental obligation, right? Their responsibility is to witness the gospel to people to try to convert them, right? Bring Jesus' gospel to all of humanity. Christians see it as a very big religious obligation. And if you meet a Christian on the street that's proselytizing, they're going to want to talk to you about religious beliefs, right? They're going to want to study the Bible with you. And their goal is to convince you that their teaching is correct and that here are the proper beliefs that you should have. Here's the beliefs, here's the experiences, here's how it all unfolds, right? And their job is to convince you of that, right? That fantasy, for lack of a better expression. If you meet a Chabad rabbi on the street, right, and those are the ones who are probably most commonly doing Jewish proselytizing, they're not going to try to convince you about the truth of Torah. They're not going to try to convince you whether or not God exists. I'm not even sure they'll pull out a Chumash. But what is it that a Chabad rabbi is going to want you to do, right? They're going to want you to put on tefillin if you're a man. And if you're a woman, they're going to want you to light Shabbat candles, right? Even there, like the basic emphasis is on the action. And again, there's theological reasons within Chabad why that's the case, right? They have a whole Kabbalistic framework that behind that. But again, you see that there's this basic emphasis that if you want to bring Jews back to the tradition, you start by getting them to do mitzvot. Chabad rabbis who are trying to reach out to Jews, they don't care what the Jews believe in, right, at all. Right? It's actually fascinating when you see this. Right? Like, Lord knows what some of the Jews think who Chabad rabbis are working with. Sometimes I worry these Jews are like, thinking Christian things, but the Chabad rabbi doesn't care, right? The focus is on, to their credit, and the focus is on, the action, getting them back to the mitzvah. They don't care if you understand the reason why you're putting on tefillin, right? They might explain it somewhat, but that's even not the the primary point, because Chabad knows that the process of returning to the tradition for a Jew begins through the performance of mitzvot. Now, Rosenzweig said that with the doing of the mitzvah, the kavanah, the spiritual intention, just the meaning of it will come, and this is important. Because there is something about the performance of mitzvot or keeping halacha that is only available to us in the experience of the doing. It's not something we can so easily grasp from the outside, but rather only from the inside. Meaning, if there is a meaning to be had in mitzvot at all, you're only going to be able to even begin to grasp it from the inside, from the doing of it, right? You can't just study Torah and figure out what mitzvot are all about. And this is significant because we might think that there's an ability just to learn Torah and understand what mitzvot aren't from the learning of Torah. But Rosenzweig knows that there's an experiential dimension to mitzvot that is really important. God's commanding voice can only be heard from inside the mitzvah. It can't be heard from outside the mitzvah. So unless you get into the mitzvah at some point, right, you're not going to be able to access or be able to experience your connection to it in the way that is ultimately necessary as a Jew. So Rosenzweig, in one of his letters to Martin Buber, uses this really interesting metaphor to capture the idea that we can only really understand mitzvot from the inside. This is a letter from a couple of years earlier to Buber, and they're already, this is in 1922, they're already having debates about the legitimacy of Jewish practice and halacha and keeping halacha, not keeping halacha. And Rosenzweig is already pushing Buber on the importance of Jewish law, Jewish practice, and Buber is already pushing back on him. Interestingly enough, Buber grew up pretty traditional. His grandfather was a very significant scholar, and Buber went to like Orthodox shuls when he was growing up, even maybe Hasidic shuls when he was growing up. And at 15, Buber sort of turns away from the tradition. But Buber did understand to a certain extent what real Judaism looks like and feels like. But at the time, Rosenzweig didn't quite know that, but he uses this very powerful metaphor to try to convince Buber that you can't just judge mitzvot from the outside. He says, the letter, this is just a piece from the letter, it's late and you must have your galleys, referring to Buber's book on I Thou, and good wishes for the Jewish New Year, whose law has governed the growth of your book, whether you like it or not. Rosenzweig's pointing out, Buber, you like to think you live outside the law, you think you're beyond halacha, but in truth, this writing and publishing of the book is still bound by the Jewish calendar, right? He's able to do or not do certain things depending on when the chagim are and working around that. So Rosenzweig just pointing out, you think you're outside of this, it's still shaping you, it's still part of you. And the fact is, because Buber grew up in it, like it's always part of him. And Buber even knows that, even as he sort of at times seems to try to run away from it. But here's Rosenzweig's metaphor. He says, it is difficult to say from the outside or even from the entrance whether the firmament still peeps in through the dome of the temple. Even in the Pantheon in Rome, you have to walk a good distance in toward the center in order to tell. So this is a picture of the Pantheon. I did not know what the Pantheon was when I first read this. The Pantheon is a dome temple originally built by the Romans, which was later transformed into a church, and now serves as the rotunda of the Cathedral of Santa Maria. And here it is from the outside. You can see the front part. You can see the back part has a bit of the round structure. It probably looks like most Greek buildings you've seen before. Nothing too special about it. You wouldn't necessarily assume that it was different from any other ancient Greek building you might have seen. However, it does have this unique rotunda, a circular domed room, which makes it special because when you go inside the Pantheon, here's what you see. Right, so it has this rotunda and it has this aperture, this hole in the top of the ceiling, which is quite impressive. And it's designed such that the sunlight can penetrate through the hole. So there's like literally a beam of light inside what was originally a Roman temple. And it enables one to see the sky. It enables one to see the light, penetrating through. And it's really quite stunning, in my opinion. It's almost as if there's this transcendent pillar of light beaming down directly from the heavens when you are inside the Pantheon. And you can probably now start to understand the metaphor Rosenzweig is getting at, why he compares mitzvot to the Pantheon. From the outside, a mitzvah could look like any other action that a person might do, no more, no less. But from the inside, it's possible that there is so much more, something that can potentially connect us to God or allow us to hear God's commanding voice from within the mitzvah, just like the pillar of light shining down from the heavens through the hole. But you got to be inside the mitzvah to have a chance to even see if there's potentially light there. As Rosenzweig's point, you got to be inside the Pantheon to know if there's still that hole there where you can see the light. There may not be. There may be mitzvah where you do and you never see the light. And Rosenzweig's certainly open to that possibility, as we've seen, but you can't tell until you're in the inside. And what Rosenzweig is talking about here is not some sort of mystical experience This isn't like the moments where suddenly you see Jesus and the heavens open up. What he's saying is that our relationship to the mitzvah fundamentally changes once we do it, once we are inside of it. Once we're inside of it, we see it differently and we relate to it differently. And there is this possibility of experiencing God's call, of feeling just pulled inexorably towards God. So if we take the two principles that Rosenzweig laid out here in the letter to Mavri Khan and the short piece to Buber, right, we see two major principles. Number one, when it comes to returning to the tradition, how we should engage with the tradition with Torah mitzvot, a Jew does not wait for inspiration and does not look to seek emotional experience in the performance of mitzvot, at least certainly not as a starting point. One simply does them. And by doing them, we create a relationship to the mitzvot that at least contains the potential for us to be bound to them. We have the possibility of discovering that they may be part of our something. That's something that Rosenzweig said, those mitzvot that we can't live without, but you cannot tell unless you're on the inside, right? You can't tell if the light is shining in. You can't hear God's call unless you're on the inside, which means you just got to do them. That's first point. Number two, we can't tell from the outside whether a particular act can really be our something for us, right? It could be not the everything or nothing, but the something. There's a dimension to any action or ritual that is only accessible to us in the doing of it, which means we have to be open to the doing of the mitzvah, even if we can't understand it, or it makes no sense to us, or even if we just think it's irrational or crazy. That you cannot judge it from the outside. There's something that can only be discerned from the inside. So even with all of this, it's still, I would say, not totally clear how we're to proceed or how Rosenzweig envisions proceeding in this return to Torah and mitzvot. Are we supposed to just try out mitzvot one by one, pick and choose and see what happens? If we like it, if it speaks to us, we should just keep on doing it. So it's interesting that some have interpreted Rosenzweig this way. Some have wanted to interpret Rosenzweig as sort of just like a pick and choose, right? Just start doing, pick and choose, see what might speak to you, and try it out, and then you'll kind of figure it out from there. So I brought one example of this. This is from a Zvi Kurzweil in an article that he writes about 3 views on revelation and law. He explores Rosenzweig in it. And this is the way he explains Rosenzweig, which you'll see I think is incorrect. He says, the ultimate decision as to the acceptance or non-acceptance of mitzvot rests with the individual. That's what he thinks Rosenzweig is saying. It's up to the person to choose. And the only criterion is the choice of ability. That's a phrase by Rosenzweig, and we're going to have to unpack what that means. But it could be read as saying, well, you just kind of have to choose and see what speaks to you. That is the inner readiness of the individual to choose the precept, choose the mitzvah, and to make the bracha on it. Rosenzweig's attitude to the law must lead to an arbitrary adoption or rejection of precepts of mitzvot on the part of the individual Jew. Right? That basically you just kind of have to pick and choose. So this is incorrect, and we're going to see, it's very clear why it's incorrect, but it's also clear why people could get this wrong. The key word here, which Kurzweil cites but misunderstands, is ability. For Rosenzweig, the criterion we use to embrace mitzvot or not is whether we have the ability to do them. But ability doesn't mean pick and choose. That's what's significant. But what exactly does it mean? Now, in The Builders, one of Rosenzweig's more well-known essays, he clarifies what he means by this idea of ability, or he sort of clarifies what he means by it. He says, thus what counts here too, in terms of trying to determine our return to Judaism to take on Torah mitzvot, is not our will, but our ability to act. Here too, the decisive thing is the selection which our ability, without regard to our will, makes out of the wealth of the possible deeds. And the emphasis here is not will, but ability. And I'll explain the distinction. Since this selection does not depend on the will, but on our ability, is a very personal one. For while a general law can address itself with its demands to the will, ability carries in itself its own law. Since there is only my, your, his ability, and built on them ours, not everybody's. So again, the cryptic word here is ability. What is Rosenzweig trying to say when he differentiates will and ability, where will is not what we do with mitzvot, but ability is? So Rosenzweig differentiates between the two, and what he means is as follows. In a philosophical sense, will means free will. right? I can will to do something or not, right? I can choose. That's what, when we say we're going to choose, it means I can will one option or another, if I'm presented from any number of options. A general law can address itself to free will, meaning laws are made and I have the capacity to choose to follow them or not. I'm driving down the highway. The law says the speed limit is 65. I can choose, I can exert my free will to follow the law or not, right? To submit to the law, to stay under 65, or to transgress the law and drive faster, right? I have the will to sort of choose to submit to the law or not. But for Rosenzweig, Jewish law does not exist to speak to our will, that we can choose to do or not do something. Jewish law exists to speak to our ability. It's not about what we choose to do, it's what we simply can or cannot do. In a sense, when it comes to ability, it's not about choice at all. And I'll try to give you an example of what I think Rosenzweig means when he says ability. My mother was a geriatric social worker. It's not easy work. She worked in nursing homes, all day, all week long, many, many years. And when you're a geriatric social worker, you're spending hour after hour with patients in nursing homes, listening to them, talking to them. It's very challenging work. People in a nursing home don't tend to get better, as you know. They're sick, they're depressed, and unfortunately, the nursing home is often the place where they die. My mother had the ability to do that kind of work. I couldn't do it. Could I do it if you put a gun to my head? Maybe, probably, but I certainly didn't have the ability to do it like my mother. For her, it was what you might describe as a calling. Like that's what ability means, that you have like a calling, like a sense that this is something you can, you should, you want to do. But it's not something you just like choose amongst many options. Your calling in life is not something that you feel like you chose, right? It's a calling because it feels like it chose you. The things we have the ability to do are things we feel connected to and that call us. And there's something about us, about them, that draws us to them. And for Rosenzweig, this idea of ability or calling applies to mitzvot as well. There are certain mitzvot we have the ability to do that others don't have the ability to do. And the reason that ability is so important for Rosenzweig is that it is only through ability that we can do an action and potentially discover it's a mitzvah. Because when we do something through our ability, and when we discover that it's calling to us, something interesting happens. We can't stop doing it, right? We keep returning to it over again. When you have a calling, no matter where you are, you feel yourself being called back to it again and again. And over time, it becomes something we can't escape. It becomes something essential for us, something that we can't live without. Rosenzweig makes this clear by pointing to the classic example of Jews accepting the mitzvot at Har Sinai. Now, you might think of that moment at Har Sinai as this free will choice, right? God presents the covenant to the people. God presents the Torah. He presents the terms and conditions. He says, read the fine print and decide whether you're going to sign on the dotted line. And of course, we can even imagine, okay, the Jewish people at Har Sinai said, we're going to sign on the dotted line. Naseh v'nishma, right? That was their answer, their agreement. We're all in. It's a choice. It's a free-willed choice. But of course, if you know anything about the way the rabbis understand Har Sinai, there's no way to look at the Kabbalah Satorah at Har Sinai as being something of a free-willed choice, right? In the rabbinic imagination, God lifts up the mountain and holds it over the Jewish people's heads, and he threatens them either accept the mitzvot or die. And the reason the rabbis say this is because the revelation of the Torah is so powerful and so overwhelming. In that moment when God is present with the Jewish people, how could the Jews really ever say no to that, right? That moment at Har Sinai is, in a sense, a moment of compulsion. And what Rosenzweig is trying to say is that when we do things because we are able to, we suddenly start to find that they become, like I said, something we can't escape from, that we are compelled by. He says it's extremely serious when reinterpreting Israel's free acceptance of God's word under Mount Sinai into a compelled acceptance, compelled by God. He lifted up the mountain like a basket until they accepted, the sages say. And you'll see the line here again, how he inserts ability into this. We may do what is in our power to remove obstacles. We can do everything we can with choicefully to try to put ourselves in a position, whether we can do mitzvot. We can and should make free our ability and power to act. But the last choice is not within our will. It is entrusted to our ability. At the end of the day, we don't choose to do mitzvot. We are able to do mitzvot. And if you are able to do it, it means you have this connection to it. And in truth, what Rosenzweig is making clear here, we're not able to do all mitzvot, right? Like on a certain level, we just can't do them all. But the ability to do the ones that we can, right? Not because we feel forced, not because they're super spiritually meaningful to us, just because we're able, speaks of a connection that we have to them that can be the foundation for something real and something more. Right, I'll give an example again using the choice of profession. Right, so before I was a rabbi, I was an engineer. My degree is in engineering. I worked for 2 years as an engineer, and what I discovered after 2 years of being an engineer is that I don't have the ability to be an engineer. I just don't. Right, I have the ability to be a rabbi. I don't have the ability to be an engineer. But when I was able to embrace that I had the ability to be a rabbi, right, that enabled a connection for me to it that was able to be the foundation of something real, that's something that could grow and something that could become fundamentally essential to who we are. So this idea of ability is I think, very, very significant. It's not a choice, right? It's just something we can and ultimately we come to feel that we must do. Rosenzweig goes on, he says, it is true that ability means not to be able to do otherwise, to be obliged to act, right? Ability is not to be able to do anything else. And when you have a calling in life, right, doctor or whatever it is, right, you don't really feel like you can do anything else. This is my ability. This is what I can do. This is what I must do. In our case, it is not up to an instinct choosing by trial and error, right? We're not picking and choosing the mitzvot and seeing how they are, like wearing them like hats or like a new outfit every day, right? We try to find the ones that we are able to do, and that's the foundation. To fight against the dangers of a return, our whole being is involved in it. A decision based on ability cannot err, since it is not choosing, but listening and therefore only accepting. For this reason, no one can take another person to task, though he can and should teach him, because only I know what I can do. Only my own ear can hear the voice of my own being, which I have to reckon with. Right, that our ability is, in a sense, as he said before, deeply personal. What you are able to do, I might not be able to do when it comes to Torah and mitzvot. But we have to be able to follow our ability if we're going to grow in a connection that's real. We have to learn how to listen to what calls us in Jewish life. And again, this doesn't mean focusing on inspiration or what's intellectually compelling, but the things that call to us in a way that we keep finding ourselves drawn to them. Those are the things that we have an ability to do. And if we have an ability to do them, we will soon discover that we have no choice but to do them. And there's something deeply personal about this. What one person has the ability to do, another does not. And what is painful coercion for another person, when they try to force themselves to do something, is inexorable necessity for another, right? If you've been a doctor for a long part of your life, and you have the ability to do it, and it's a calling, and it's just something you do. It becomes part of who you are. You don't question it. It doesn't feel like, oh my God, I hate that they are forcing me to do X, Y, Z. I mean, there's always aspects of the job that might be difficult, but on a certain very basic, fundamental, existential level to who you are, you just do these things. They're part of who you are, and that's it, right? You have to. That's the way you are in the world. That's what you have the ability to be in the world. Sometimes we don't really know if we have the ability to do something or not until we are distant from it. I think this is just, I wanted to bring this up as a side point. For the baal teshuvah, it's about discovering the things that we have the ability for. Those are new things for the baal teshuvah. But if you already have a religious identity, if you already do mitzvot, if you already keep halacha, then where does ability fall within that? Where's your something? Where's the dimension of it that you know you can't live without? And sometimes we only realize that when we are distant from it. Right? When there are certain things that we took for granted that are suddenly no longer there. And when they're no longer there, we recognize just how fundamental they are to us. Right? Sort of the common example of this, if you're familiar with romantic comedies. So romantic comedies, the whole engine of the plot of a romantic comedy is one person loves the other person and the other person doesn't know it or simply doesn't love them back. right? And that's the conflict that needs to be resolved. Like, how is it that the two parties are going to realize that they love each other? So there's like many ways this can take place, but one of the ways that romantic comedies always get resolved is at a certain point, the two parties separate for one reason or another, and the party who had not been the ones who originally loved the other suddenly realized when the other side is gone that they actually do love them, right? Like they have this moment, oh, I did love them. They loved me all this time. I didn't realize it. Now they're gone. I do love them. And I think for people who do grow up religious, this sense of what is it that we love? What is it that we're bound to? What is it that we have the ability to do? Sometimes we only realize it when certain things fall away. And I'll just give one example from my own. Well, first off, we know this in Rosenzweig's life, right? He only really realizes his inexorable connection to Judaism when he almost converts to Christianity. When everything else gets stripped away, that's when he realizes how much it is a fundamental part of who he is. In my own life, I very much felt this during Corona, in a place I wasn't totally expecting it. So when Corona hit, and this is still, I think, the case today for a lot of us, that the ability to go to shul just dramatically changed and dramatically diminished. And for me, it's funny. I was a shul rabbi for a long time, and I grew up going to shul all the time, and I love shul. But after all those years of being a shul rabbi, part of me was sort of like when I got to Israel, you know what? I don't know how much I need it. Like I still go to shul pretty regularly, but I wasn't as religious about davening at shul as I was certainly when I was a synagogue rabbi. I felt like I said I'd had a lot of it. I could go a couple of years with a little bit less. And then Corona hit, and I wasn't able to go to shul at all. And suddenly in that moment is when I realized just how much it fundamentally meant to me, right? That I have an ability to go to shul. I always have. It's something I connect to. It's something I feel called to. But I didn't realize what that really meant to me until it suddenly wasn't there. And I remember in the early weeks of Corona, when things were really scary in the world, and there really weren't supposed to be any davening indoors at all, I happened to be walking down the street in our neighborhood, and I happened to catch a small Sephardi shul that was having a minyan inside, which they weren't supposed to do, and it was dangerous. And all I remember thinking was, I want to go in there and daven with them. Like I just want to go sit down with these, 9 other guys and pray to God. And I felt like a calling to do it like I'd never felt before. Specifically in that moment when it felt like shul wasn't even a possibility for me or for any of us. And there is something to this, that we only recognize those things that we have the ability to do, the things that we ultimately can feel compelled to do, when it's suddenly taken away from us. And because when we're religious, we don't go through this process of, okay, really finding those things that we are drawn to. It's sort of all thrown on you. And sometimes the only way to realize what truly is necessary and essential, and that's something, is when it's suddenly taken away. And the pandemic, I think, has done that for a lot of us on a lot of things. But the things that we feel missing, that we really, really feel missing, Rosenzweig would say you got to take a note of that, because there's something deeply important there about your connection to those things. The last thing that I want or the last 2 things we'll do real quick here, is that Rosenzweig is open about his own process of returning to the tradition. He doesn't write about it in a ton of places, but I wanted to bring one example because I think it helps clarify that he recognizes that there's something messy about this. So he writes here, this is a letter to Benno Jacob, who was a pretty well-known Reform rabbi, Bible scholar. Rosenzweig letters at this time, was mid-late 20s, they alternate between Reform rabbis and Orthodox rabbis, right? He really is navigating a path here that's really interesting, in that he builds relationships on all sides. And in his letters with Benno Jacob, he's trying to convince Benno Jacob about the significance of halacha, and that the Reform approach to it is problematic. And I just bring a little piece here in which he reflects on his own attempt to take on Jewish practice. So he opens up the letter by referring to the practice of Zionists in the land of Israel. Zionists who have moved to Israel to settle the land, they're secular for the most part. They don't keep Shabbat. And here's how Rosenzweig relates to it. He says, but take the observance of the Sabbath. The Orthodox may consider smoking, writing letters, or the holding of sports festivals on the part of the settlers as Chilul Shabbat. But we cannot feel that way about it, least of all myself. Right? The traditional Orthodox look at the Zionists who aren't really keeping Shabbat and see them as being violating the prohibitions of Shabbat. They're Machalel Shabbat. But that doesn't bother Rosenzweig so much because at the very least, for the Zionists, Shabbat feels like a fundamentally different day in Israel. It's not like the rest of the week, right? They may be smoking or playing sports, but it's not a weekday. It's not a business day. And that distinction between the weekday and Shabbat is still very much felt in Israel, even if it's not a halachic Shabbat per se. It's still not like the rest of the week. And what Rosenzweig goes on to describe is that as he became more Shomer mitzvot, Shomer Shabbat, he initially didn't hold all of the halachot around Shabbat, about malacha on Shabbat. He doesn't hold all the distinctions of the rabbis. There are many rabbinic distinctions, rabbinic prohibitions, gezerot. There are many times the rabbis say you can't do X, even though X technically is permitted because X might lead to Y, and Y is biblically prohibited. So it's clear that Rosenzweig doesn't initially buy into those arguments. And he says, originally when it came to a Shabbos observance, I made it my principle to refrain from all business correspondence on the Sabbath, but saw no harm in writing letters to friends. Right? He thought I could make this distinction, right? It's not the writing that's the problem. It's the sort of the spirit of it. So I can write to friends, but I won't write for business. He says, nor did I give up this liberal interpretation of keeping the Sabbath until once when Henry Rothschild and I were discussing some matter concerning the warehouse, he tried to make me jot down notes. Since, so he said, I did not mind writing on the Shabbat. So it sounds like Henry Rothschild is like Shomer Shabbat. And he's saying to Rosenzweig while they're having this great conversation about the warehouse, you don't keep Shabbos. Why don't you go make sure I write this down so we don't forget it. And in that moment, Rosenzweig realizes something. He says, that experience which taught me how unfeasible it is to draw such fine distinctions unless everyone else draws them too, finally drove me to accept the Orthodox practice on this point. Though to come to that decision was not easy to me. Basically, Rosenzweig realized you can't start making all of these distinctions. It just doesn't work and be able to keep Shabbos properly. Therefore, how can I regard as less good Jews all those who observe the Sabbath in the liberal way, which seems adequate for us today and which I myself give up only under duress? Meaning, as long as the secular Zionists are keeping Shabbat as a different day, at least it's something significant that we should be recognizing, and it creates that possibility of something more. Right? They're already inside the mitzvah, at least a little bit. And if they're already inside the mitzvah a little bit, there's a possibility for more. Because Rosenzweig himself, we see how he went through a process where he was able to kind of go more. He was inside the mitzvah of keeping Shabbos, and he started to realize there's more to it that he couldn't see from the outside, right? He sort of starts with what you might say is sort of like the classic conservative movement approach, right? The famous conservative teshuvah from the 50s, right? You can drive on Shabbat as long as it's the shul and back, right? Those kind of distinctions. And we know those distinctions just don't work. And Rosenzweig had to kind of learn that. But what's really fascinating for me about this, I have to be honest, and this is where he's different from the conservative movement, not to pick on the conservative movement too much here, is that once Rosenzweig had made this decision, I'm going to do this, but I'm not going to do that on Shabbat, he didn't let that be the end of it. He didn't say, okay, I've got to figure it out. This is what I'm going to do, and that's the way it's going to be forever. He was willing to recognize that no matter how he may have approached the mitzvah or halacha, that it was subject to change. Most of us are not like this when it comes to our religious observance. Most of us decide beforehand. We say, I'm going to go this far, but no farther, and that's it. We figured it out. We figured out the way it works for us, and that's the end of the story. I'm going to keep a kosher at home, but not on the outside. Or I'm not going to watch TV on Shabbat, but it's okay if I write some notes down, right? We make these distinctions, and we leave it at that. And that's the end of the story. We decide what we're going to do, and we're not open to the possibility of change. But Rosenzweig is, and that's something that's really, really hard, because it means that you cannot go into this thinking you know where it's going to end. And most of us do not like to go into things not knowing where it's going to end. We want to feel like we're in control. And I think it shows profound humility and profound religious insight that once he was inside of it, he recognized that it could be different. Because I hate to say this, the conservative movement didn't realize that. They wrote that teshuvah saying people could drive on Shabbat, and people drove everywhere, and there was no longer Shabbat, right? They've never really admitted to that, right? That was like a bad thing to do, because when you approach things ideologically, you can't admit to it, right? Once you have the ideological orientation, right? That's what it is. But Rosenzweig's whole point here is that we eschew ideology. Once we're inside of it, we have to be open to the possibilities of where it can change us, and open to the possibilities that we might be wrong, that how we thought going in might end up being totally wrong in the end, and we don't know where that's going to take us. The last thing I want to finish with is another really important piece from an essay of Rosenzweig, where he is trying to, again, get at this question of why we do mitzvot and what do we experience in the context of mitzvot. And here's how he says it. He says, we wholly realize, this is just a piece from a much larger essay, we wholly realize the general theological connection only when we cause it to come alive by fulfilling individual commandments and transpose it from the objectivity of a theological truth to the vow of a benediction. So we only begin to understand the implications of religious life, of mitzvot, not by studying texts, not by philosophizing, not by imposing some sort of ideology, or trying to understand why and how they should be so meaningful for us, but when we do mitzvot. It's in the doing that they go from this objective theory to an actual living reality. Because only when we do mitzvot can they go from something out there to something that's real for us. And nothing makes this more clear than the bracha we recite before doing them. That's why he says the vow of the benediction. Because when you recite the bracha before a mitzvah, we're not speaking to ourselves, and it's not theoretical at that point. We are speaking to God. We are saying, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God. We are directing ourselves to God. And that simple act, if we take it seriously, means we are now at least attempting to deal with something real. There's no longer theory, it's no longer book, it's us and God on some level, whatever we understand that to mean or whatever it can mean. But it's orienting us in a very different kind of way. It's actually, in a certain sense, not always so hard to try to find out what the meaning of a mitzvah might be or what the purpose of a mitzvah might be. I mean, rabbis have been doing this for thousands of years, right? They'll explain to you all the inner dimensions of mitzvot and what the purpose is and what they achieve and all of those kinds of things, right? Well, somebody can study the laws of family purity, and when they realize that a husband and a wife have to separate for 2 weeks out of the month because she's in nida, that at the end of the day, after she goes to the mikvah, she comes back and they can suddenly have a deeper relationship. And the whole point of Taharat HaMishpacha is to deepen the relationship between the husband and a wife so that the mikvah night is like the wedding night. You can come up with all of these rationalizations. And in a certain sense, some of it may be correct. And I don't want to totally dismiss that. But to think about mitzvah purely in those terms is to miss something fundamentally important. He says, here too, the incomprehensibility from the viewpoint of religion of the individual commandment does not constitute incomprehensibility per se, right? On a certain level, mitzvot don't make sense, but people are always coming up with reasons for them. He gives a list here, right? William James, famous scholar of religion, can explain religious practice in terms of experience and what the experience brings about. Freud can explain it psychoanalytically, and Max Weber can explain it sociologically. We can come up with reasons why religious rituals exist. It's actually not that hard. Some of them are better than others, but that doesn't get at what the mitzvah ultimately is for us at the end of the day. And here's the reason why. And this is probably one of my favorite lines in all of Rosenzweig, right? We know it. We know the mitzvah differently, not always, and not in all things, but again and again. For we know it only when we do, right? There's something we know about it that can only be when we do it. We know it differently in the doing. So what is it that we know about the halacha, about the mitzvah, when we're actually starting to do it? Well, at the very least, we know that all those reasons we might tell ourselves for doing or not doing a mitzvah are nowhere near sufficient to explain why we do it. You realize at the moment you start doing it, right? That like all that fancy reasons, it kind of goes out the window. Certainly not, as Rosenzweig says here, certainly not all of those historical and sociological explanations are false. It's not that they're all wrong, but in the light of the doing, of the right doing, in which we experience the reality of the law, the explanations are of superficial and subsidiary importance. So they just don't matter that much, right? We're doing it because that's what Jews do, right? We're commanded and we do it, and they become part of who we are. The things that the mitzvot are the things that we cannot live without. And Rosenzweig concludes, he says, only in the commandment can the voice of him who commands be heard. This is, again, this is like Rosenzweig in a nutshell. You cannot have a real relationship with God as a Jew other than through commandments, because you can't hear God's voice commanding, which is the essence of revelation, right? The essence of revelation, Rosenzweig, is God's commanding voice. The only place you can hear God's commanding voice is in the performance of a mitzvah. No matter how well the written word may fit in with our own thoughts, no matter how well we think we've figured out Torah and what it means and how it's supposed to manifest in our lives. It cannot give us the faith that creation is completed to the degree that we experience this by keeping the Shabbat and inaugurating it with Vayechulu Hashemayim va'aretz, right? That the heaven and the earth were completed, right? There's something that you can only understand about Shabbat from the inside, from experiencing it. That no matter how much you study the halachot of Shabbat or anything else, you just cannot get. Not that doing necessarily results in hearing. It's not that every time we do a mitzvah we hear God's voice. Far from it, unfortunately, and understanding. But here's the point. This is the key line. But one hears differently when one hears in the doing. Right? There's just something you have access to in the doing that you cannot have otherwise. And this, by the way, is the real meaning of Naseh v'nishma at Har Sinai. Right? What does Naseh v'nishma mean? The Jews say this as the moment when they enter into the covenant. We will do and we will hear. Right? In the doing of the mitzvah, we experience the potential of hearing God's call. And saying Baruch Atah Hashem in return, right? Blessed are you, God, right? That is us orienting ourselves to that response, to be able to say to God, here I am. And the only way to even get there is just to start doing it, right? Not because of this fantasy of like what religious life is supposed to be like. Whatever fantasies people have about Hasidim, I can tell you right now, like 99% of it is totally disconnected from the reality of their lives. Right? They're no more religious. They're no more spiritual than like many very, very modern people in many ways. At the end of the day, we just have to do. And one of the most incredible things about being a Jew is that when you do the mitzvah, you have that potential of hearing something that you've never heard before.